Have you ever wondered if your most deeply held moral beliefs actually contradict each other? What if I told you that the ethical foundations you've built your life upon contain hidden paradoxes that, when followed to their logical conclusions, begin to unmake reality itself? Tonight, we're diving into 7 layers of moral paradoxes that challenge the very fabric of how we understand right and wrong. These aren't simple philosophical puzzles. They're gateways to a profound transformation of consciousness. Imagine standing at the edge of a trolley track, your hand on a lever that will determine who lives and who dies. Or picture yourself as both the architect of future generations and their potential destroyer. These moral mazes don't just challenge what you think, they challenge who you are. As you journey with me through these 7 paradoxes, prepare to have your certainties dissolved and your moral imagination expanded in ways you never thought possible. As you settle into a comfortable position, allow your body to sink gently into the surface beneath you. Take a slow, deep breath, in through your nose, filling your lungs completely, and then out through your mouth, releasing any tension you've been carrying. With each breath, feel yourself becoming a little heavier, a little more at ease. Tonight, I invite you on a journey not through landscapes or distant planets, but through the terrain of our deepest moral intuitions, those fundamental convictions that seem as solid and reliable as the ground beneath your feet. Imagine, if you will, that your understanding of right and wrong, good and bad, just and unjust, forms the very foundation upon which your perception of reality rests. These aren't merely opinions or preferences. They're the invisible architecture supporting your entire worldview. They determine how you interpret events, judge actions, form relationships, and make meaning of your existence. In many ways, these moral intuitions are more fundamental than your understanding of physics or biology, for they shape not just how you think the world works, but how you believe it should work. Now, imagine finding yourself in a dream where the laws of physics begin to behave strangely. Objects that should fall begin to float. Doorways lead to unexpected places. Causes no longer produce their expected effects. At first, this creates a sense of disorientation, perhaps even alarm. But as the dream continues, this initial discomfort often gives way to curiosity, then to a kind of peaceful surrender to the dream's internal logic, or lack thereof. There's a certain liberation in watching the rules of reality gently dissolve around you, while you remain safe within the experience. This dream state offers us a perfect analogy for what we'll explore together tonight. We'll examine 7 moral paradoxes, situations where our deepest ethical intuitions, when followed to their logical conclusions, begin to contradict each other. Like the physics of a dream gradually unraveling, these paradoxes cause the seemingly solid ground of our moral understanding to shift beneath us. And just as in a dream, this dissolution can be both unsettling and strangely liberating, opening spaces for new kinds of understanding. Moral paradoxes differ fundamentally from logical paradoxes, though both challenge our thinking. A logical paradox, like the famous liar paradox. This statement is false, creates a self-contradictory loop in our reasoning. If the statement is true, then it must be false. If it's false, then it must be true. Such paradoxes are puzzling, even fascinating, but they primarily challenge our rational thinking, our ability to manipulate concepts and propositions. Moral paradoxes operate at a deeper level. They don't merely challenge how we think, they undermine what we care about, what we value, what we believe to be fundamental to human flourishing and right action. They create situations where our deepest moral commitments that feel as certain and immovable as anything in our experience, come into direct conflict with each other. In these conflicts, we discover that the moral foundation we thought was solid may actually be composed of shifting, sometimes incompatible elements. Take, for instance, our intuition that innocence should be protected. Few moral convictions feel more certain than this. Yet situations arise where protecting one innocent person may require harming another. Or consider our belief in personal responsibility, that people should be held accountable for their actions. This seems incontestable until we recognize how profoundly chance and circumstance shape both character and opportunity. As we'll explore tonight, each of these intuitions, and many others, leads us into paradoxical terrain where certainty dissolves and the moral landscape becomes strange and unfamiliar. These paradoxes have haunted philosophical thinking since its earliest beginnings. The ancient Greeks recognized the tragic dimensions of moral life, situations where no matter what one does, some important value will be compromised. Sophocles' Antigone must choose between honoring divine law by burying her brother and obeying civil law by leaving him unburied. Both obligations are sacred. Both cannot be simultaneously fulfilled. The moral universe suddenly reveals itself as fundamentally conflicted. Throughout history, philosophers have continued to discover and explore such paradoxes. Immanuel Kant, in the 18th century, recognized that our intuition about the absolute value of truth-telling creates paradoxical situations when telling the truth would lead to grave harm. John Stuart Mill, in the 19th century, grappled with how our intuitions about maximizing happiness can lead to conclusions that seem to undermine individual rights. In our own era, philosophers like Derek Parfit, Judith Jarvis Thomson, and Bernard Williams have unearthed moral paradoxes of increasing subtlety and depth, revealing conflicts within our ethical thinking that no theoretical approach has fully resolved. Tonight, we'll explore 7 distinct layers of moral paradox, each penetrating deeper into the foundations of our ethical understanding. Like descending through layers of earth toward a mysterious core, each paradox will take us further from the familiar surface of moral certainty toward more fundamental questions about the nature of value, responsibility, and meaning. With each layer, another aspect of what we thought we knew about right and wrong will gently dissolve, creating space for a different kind of understanding to emerge. Our journey begins with familiar moral territory, questions about saving lives and preventing harm, before progressing to more abstract considerations about the nature of moral judgment itself, the relationship between individuals and values, and ultimately the very possibility of living a moral life in an imperfect world. Each paradox illuminates a different fault line in our moral understanding, a different way in which our ethical intuitions, when followed to their natural conclusions, begin to contradict and undermine each other. You might wonder why we would embark on such a journey as you prepare for rest. Wouldn't contemplating moral uncertainty be more likely to create anxiety than peaceful sleep? In fact, there's something deeply relaxing about temporarily suspending our need for moral certainty. Much of our daily mental tension comes from trying to maintain consistent ethical positions in a complex world, from the effort of reconciling our various values and principles in the face of difficult situations. There's a certain exhaustion that comes from maintaining moral certainty, from holding rigid ethical boundaries against the complexity of lived experience. When we allow ourselves to recognize the paradoxical nature of moral reality, when we temporarily suspend the demand that our ethical intuitions form a perfectly coherent system, we release a particular kind of mental tension. This doesn't mean abandoning our values or embracing moral nihilism. Rather, it means acknowledging the limitations of our moral understanding, the inevitable incompleteness of any ethical framework. There's humility in this recognition, and with humility comes a certain ease. Consider how we typically approach moral questions in our waking, analytical state. We often feel compelled to reach definitive conclusions, to determine the right answer, to resolve contradictions and establish certainty. This approach has its place, particularly when immediate action is required. But it also creates a kind of rigidity in our thinking, a narrowing of perspective that can blind us to the full complexity of moral reality. In the relaxed, receptive state between wakefulness and sleep, what psychologists call the hypnagogic state, our minds process information differently. Boundaries between concepts become more fluid. Contradictions can coexist without creating tension. Intuitive connections emerge that our analytical thinking might miss. In this state, moral paradoxes need not be problems to be solved but rather landscapes to be explored, revealing dimensions of ethical reality that our waking consciousness, with its demand for resolution, might never access. Many contemplative traditions recognize this connection between the relaxed mind and deeper insight. Zen Buddhist koans, paradoxical statements or questions like, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" are designed not to be solved through analytical thinking but to be held in awareness until a different kind of understanding emerges. Similarly, the Taoist concept of wu-wei or non-doing suggests that certain forms of wisdom emerge not through striving effort but through receptive attention and the suspension of ordinary categorical thinking. As you explore these moral paradoxes tonight, I invite you to approach them not as puzzles demanding resolution but as openings into a more spacious understanding. Allow your analytical mind to rest. There's no need to reach conclusions or establish certainty. Instead, simply notice how each paradox creates a particular feeling or quality of awareness. Notice how certainty dissolves, how familiar moral terrain becomes strange, how the boundaries between seemingly distinct categories, right and wrong, good and bad, action and inaction, begin to blur and shift. This blurring of boundaries mirrors what happens naturally as we transition towards sleep. In waking consciousness, we maintain clear distinctions between self and other, inside and outside, present and past. As we drift towards sleep, these boundaries soften. Our thoughts begin to take on the fluid, associative quality of dreams. Images and ideas flow into each other. Contradictions coexist without creating tension. Perhaps this is why the threshold of sleep offers unique access to insights and integrations unavailable to our waking mind. It allows elements of experience that our analytical thinking keeps separate to combine and communicate in unexpected ways. The paradoxes we'll explore tonight create a similar state of fluid, boundary-dissolving awareness. They don't lead to conclusions but to openings, spaces where rigid certainty gives way to more flexible, nuanced understanding. As your analytical mind relaxes its grip on moral questions, you may find insights emerging not as explicit answers but as subtle shifts in how you hold the questions themselves. These shifts might not be immediately translatable into words or propositions, but they nonetheless represent real developments in moral understanding. There's a specific kind of peace that comes with recognizing the limitations of our moral frameworks, not as a defeat or surrender, but as an accurate perception of the nature of ethical reality itself. Just as the physicist who deeply understands quantum mechanics finds peace in recognizing the fundamental uncertainty built into physical reality, we might find a similar peace in recognizing the inherent paradoxes within moral reality. This isn't giving up on ethics, it's understanding ethics more deeply. As you continue to relax, feeling your body growing heavier and your mind more receptive, imagine certainty not as a solid state to be achieved but as a fluid spectrum to be navigated. Imagine moral understanding not as a fixed map but as a living relationship with an ever-changing landscape. With each breath, allow your need for absolute certainty to dissolve a little more, creating space for a different kind of moral awareness to emerge, one that embraces complexity, honors contradiction, and remains open to the mystery at the heart of ethical life. Now, as you feel yourself sinking deeper into this receptive state, let's descend into the first layer of moral paradox, a dilemma that reveals how our most basic intuition about saving lives can lead us into a labyrinth where certainty dissolves and the distinction between action and inaction blurs. As you continue to relax, imagine yourself standing in a misty forest at dawn. The air is cool and still. Through the gentle fog, you can see train tracks stretching before you, gleaming with morning dew. As you follow these tracks with your eyes, you notice something peculiar. They begin to diverge, splitting into two separate paths that disappear into the mist. This quiet forest scene harbors within it one of philosophy's most revealing moral paradoxes, a thought experiment that begins with a simple scenario but leads us into increasingly complex ethical terrain. This is the trolley problem, first formulated by philosopher Philippa Foot in 1967 and later elaborated by Judith Jarvis Thomson. At first glance, it presents a straightforward moral calculation. Yet, as we follow its branching tracks, we discover how our deepest moral intuitions can lead us in contradictory directions, revealing fault lines in the very foundation of our ethical understanding. Picture yourself standing beside these train tracks. In the distance, you hear the rumble of an approaching trolley. As it emerges from the mist, you realize with horror that the trolley is out of control, its brakes have failed, and it's racing down the track. Ahead lie 5 people who are tied to the track, unable to escape. The trolley is headed straight for them, and if it continues on its current path, all 5 will certainly die. But just before you stands a lever. If you pull this lever, the trolley will be diverted to a different track. This seems like salvation, until you notice that there is one person tied to this second track. The dilemma crystallizes in your mind with terrible clarity. Do nothing, and 5 people die. Pull the lever, and 1 person dies. What would you do? When presented with this scenario, most people, about 90% in various studies, say they would pull the lever. The calculation seems straightforward. Better that 1 person die than 5. This utilitarian reasoning suggests that the morally correct action is the one that produces the greatest good for the greatest number, or in this case, the least harm overall. 5 deaths represent more suffering than 1 death, so diverting the trolley seems not only permissible but perhaps even obligatory. But now, let's slightly alter the scenario. Imagine instead that you're standing on a footbridge over the trolley tracks. Below you, the same runaway trolley approaches, still on course to kill 5 people. This time, there's no lever to pull. But standing next to you on the bridge is a very large person, and you realize that if you push this person off the bridge and onto the tracks, their body would be substantial enough to stop the trolley, saving the 5 people ahead. The mathematical equation remains identical: sacrifice 1 life to save 5, yet when presented with this variation, most people recoil. Suddenly, the utilitarian calculation that seemed so clear in the first scenario feels inadequate, even wrong. Studies consistently show that while about 90% of people would pull the lever in the first scenario, only about 10% would push the large person in the second. Something profound has shifted in our moral intuition, despite the identical numerical outcome. This stark reversal reveals that our moral judgments are not based solely on calculating outcomes. Something else, something deeper and perhaps more mysterious, is shaping our responses. What makes these scenarios so powerful is that they reveal contradictions within our moral intuitions that we might never notice in everyday life. They show us that we simultaneously hold values that, in certain situations, cannot be reconciled. We value minimizing harm, which pulls us toward the utilitarian calculation of saving 5 over 1. But we also hold deep intuitions about the wrongness of using a person merely as a means to an end, of directly causing harm rather than redirecting an existing threat, of violating bodily autonomy through physical intervention. The trolley problem has a rich philosophical history. Philippa Foot originally introduced it as part of a broader discussion about the moral distinction between doing and allowing, between actions and omissions. Is there a meaningful moral difference between actively causing harm and merely allowing harm to occur when you could prevent it? The lever scenario and the footbridge scenario help isolate this question by creating situations where the outcomes are identical but our intuitions diverge dramatically. Judith Jarvis Thomson later expanded the thought experiment with additional variations that probe other aspects of our moral intuitions. In one variant, the single person on the side track is your child or loved one. In another, you're a surgeon who could harvest organs from one healthy person to save 5 dying patients. Each variation illuminates different dimensions of our moral thinking, revealing the complex interplay of principles that guide our ethical judgments. What makes the trolley problem particularly valuable is how it reveals tensions between major ethical frameworks that have shaped human moral thought for centuries. The utilitarian perspective, developed by philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, focuses on outcomes, calculating the overall happiness or suffering produced by an action. From this perspective, both trolley scenarios have identical moral calculations. Sacrificing 1 to save 5 produces better outcomes overall. But deontological ethics, associated most prominently with Immanuel Kant, focuses instead on the intrinsic rightness or wrongness of actions themselves, regardless of their consequences. Kant's categorical imperative tells us never to use a person merely as a means to an end, but always to treat humanity as an end in itself. This principle seems violated much more directly in the footbridge scenario, where we actively use another person's body as a tool to stop the trolley, than in the lever scenario, where the single person's death is a foreseeable but not intended consequence of redirecting the trolley. As you continue to relax and contemplate these branching moral tracks, consider how our intuitions about these scenarios might reflect deeply embedded aspects of our evolutionary and cultural history. Some researchers suggest that the footbridge scenario activates more ancient, emotion-based moral responses, the physical, personal nature of pushing someone triggers emotional aversions that override utilitarian calculation. The lever scenario, being more distant and mechanical, allows the newer, more calculation-based parts of our moral psychology to dominate. Others point to the distinction between intended and merely foreseen consequences, what philosophers call the doctrine of double effect. When you pull the lever, your intention is to save the 5 people. The death of the one person is a foreseen but unintended side effect. When you push the large person, their death is the very means by which you intend to save the 5. This distinction between intending harm and merely foreseeing it has deep roots in many moral traditions, from Catholic moral theology to common law distinctions between murder and manslaughter. These trolley scenarios also reveal something profound about moral responsibility and agency. When you pull the lever, you're redirecting an existing threat. When you push the person, you're creating a new threat. This distinction between redirecting harm and creating harm touches on fundamental questions about the scope of our moral responsibility. Are we equally responsible for harms we allow as for harms we cause? Does physical distance, or the directness of our involvement change the moral weight of our decisions? In recent years, the trolley problem has transcended philosophical thought experiments to become relevant in very practical domains. As we develop self-driving cars, we're programming machines that may someday face trolley-like scenarios, situations where harm is inevitable, and the AI must decide how to distribute that harm. Should a self-driving car swerve to avoid hitting 5 pedestrians if doing so would kill its single passenger? Should it prioritize children over adults, or treat all human lives as having equal value? The abstract trolley on misty tracks has suddenly become a concrete engineering problem. Similarly, medical resource allocation during crises like the COVID-19 pandemic has raised trolley-like dilemmas. When ventilators are scarce, who receives treatment? Is it better to save many people with moderate chances of survival or fewer people with excellent chances? The utilitarian and deontological tensions revealed by the trolley problem suddenly become matters of policy and protocol, with real lives in the balance. As you contemplate these dilemmas, notice how they create a particular quality of awareness, a recognition that moral certainty often dissolves when we probe deeply enough. There's something both unsettling and liberating in this recognition. Unsettling because we naturally seek clear moral guidelines. Liberating because acknowledging complexity often leads to more nuanced, contextual moral understanding. The trolley problem doesn't have a single, correct answer. That's precisely what makes it a paradox rather than merely a difficult choice. Its value lies not in reaching a definitive conclusion but in revealing the complex, sometimes contradictory nature of our moral intuitions. By illuminating tensions between different ethical frameworks and different aspects of our moral psychology, it helps us develop a more textured understanding of ethical thinking itself. As you continue to relax, imagine those trolley tracks fading back into the mist, the dilemma gently receding from immediate concern. Perhaps in this twilight state between wakefulness and sleep, you can hold the contradictions revealed by the trolley problem without needing to resolve them. There's a particular kind of wisdom in recognizing that moral reality sometimes contains genuine paradoxes, situations where equally valid principles come into authentic conflict. This recognition doesn't mean abandoning moral judgment altogether. Rather, it invites a more humble, nuanced approach to ethical questions, one that acknowledges the limitations of any single moral framework and remains open to the complex interplay of principles, intuitions, and contextual factors that shape our moral landscape. As the trolley fades into the distance of your mind, allow your thoughts to drift toward a deeper paradox, one that questions whether the virtue we call tolerance can survive its own principles, or whether it contains the seeds of its own dissolution. As the trolley scenario recedes from your awareness, allow your mind to drift toward the second layer of moral paradox, one that emerges not from a dramatic external dilemma but from within one of our most cherished liberal values. This paradox reveals how even our noblest principles can turn against themselves when followed to their logical conclusions, creating a philosophical puzzle with no easy resolution. Consider your body's immune system, that remarkable network of cells and processes designed to protect you from harmful invaders. To function properly, your immune system must maintain a delicate balance. It must be open and tolerant enough to allow beneficial elements to enter and remain. The nutrients you consume, the beneficial bacteria in your gut, the oxygen you breathe. Yet it must also recognize when this openness becomes vulnerability, when tolerance becomes susceptibility. An immune system with no boundaries, one that tolerates everything, would quickly fail in its protective function, allowing pathogens to multiply unchecked. Conversely, an immune system that rejects everything foreign would attack beneficial elements, and eventually the body itself, as happens in autoimmune disorders. This balancing act of the immune system offers us a powerful analogy for understanding our second moral paradox, the paradox of tolerance. Just as your body must determine the proper limits of biological tolerance, societies and individuals must navigate the boundaries of social and moral tolerance. And just as with the immune system, getting this balance wrong can lead to catastrophic outcomes, either the equivalent of an infection that overwhelms the system or an autoimmune response that attacks what it should protect. The paradox of tolerance was most famously articulated by philosopher Karl Popper in his 1945 book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. Popper observed that unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance itself. If a society is unlimited in its tolerance, if it tolerates even the most intolerant ideologies and groups, then these intolerant elements may grow in strength and eventually overthrow the tolerant society altogether, eliminating tolerance as a value. As Popper wrote, "If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed, and tolerance with them." To appreciate the depth of this paradox, we must understand the historical context in which Popper was writing. Having fled his native Austria following the rise of Nazism, Popper witnessed firsthand how the openness and tolerance of democratic societies could be exploited by deeply intolerant movements. The Weimar Republic, with its liberal democratic constitution, had extended legal protections and political rights to groups explicitly committed to destroying democracy itself. The Nazi Party used the freedoms of speech, assembly, and political participation to gain power democratically, only to eliminate those very freedoms once in control. This historical experience gave Popper's philosophical observation an urgent, practical dimension. The paradox wasn't merely a theoretical puzzle but a matter of existential concern for liberal democratic societies. It raised a profound question: how can a society committed to tolerance as a core value protect itself from those who would use that very tolerance to undermine and eventually destroy it? The paradox cuts to the heart of what we mean by tolerance. In its simplest formulation, tolerance involves accepting or allowing beliefs, practices, or behaviors that one might personally disagree with or disapprove of. It's rooted in recognition of human diversity, a commitment to peaceful coexistence despite differences, and a certain humility about the certainty of one's own views. These are noble aspirations, central to liberal democratic values and to many ethical and religious traditions worldwide. Yet the paradox of tolerance reveals that this value, when made absolute and unlimited, can undermine itself. Tolerance without boundaries becomes self-defeating. A society that tolerates groups advocating violence against minorities, or movements seeking to abolish democratic freedoms, may eventually find those very values of tolerance and pluralism under existential threat. The principle of tolerance, pushed to its logical extreme, seems to negate itself. While Popper gave this paradox its most famous formulation, similar ideas have appeared throughout philosophical history. In ancient Athens, Plato wrestled with related questions in The Republic, considering how a just society should respond to unjust elements within it. Medieval philosophers like Thomas Aquinas considered when tolerance of religious difference was appropriate, and when it might threaten the common good. The American pragmatist philosopher John Dewey grappled with how democratic societies could maintain their openness while defending themselves against anti-democratic forces. Across different cultural and historical contexts, thinkers have recognized this fundamental tension, that openness, when absolute, creates vulnerability, that tolerance, when unlimited, contains the seeds of its own potential destruction. This recognition isn't a rejection of tolerance as a value but an acknowledgement of its inherent complexity, its need for thoughtful boundaries and self-protective limitations. As you continue to relax, letting your body grow heavier and your mind more receptive, consider how this paradox plays out in contemporary societies. Liberal democracies around the world face ongoing questions about the proper limits of tolerance. Should societies tolerate speech that advocates violence against minority groups? Should religious exemptions be granted for practices that conflict with broader social values? Should political parties be allowed to participate in democratic processes if their stated goal is to end democracy itself? These aren't merely abstract philosophical questions but practical challenges that shape law, policy, and civic life. Different societies have reached different conclusions. Some European countries, with the historical memory of fascism still vivid, have laws against hate speech and Holocaust denial, placing explicit limits on tolerance in the name of protecting democratic values. The United States, with its strong First Amendment tradition, generally permits a wider range of speech, including expressions of intolerance, based on the principle that the marketplace of ideas will ultimately reject harmful ideologies without legal intervention. Social media platforms face their own version of this dilemma. Should they maintain a neutral stance toward all content, allowing even the most hateful or misleading material in the name of free expression? Or should they actively moderate content, removing or limiting certain viewpoints to protect users and the broader social fabric? Each approach involves navigating the paradox of tolerance, recognizing that both unlimited openness and excessive restriction carry their own risks. What makes this paradox particularly challenging is that it involves a tension between present and future expressions of the same value. Allowing intolerant speech or movements today, in the name of tolerance, might lead to less tolerance tomorrow if those movements gain power. Restricting certain expressions of intolerance now, in the name of preserving tolerance in the long term, means being less tolerant in the present. The paradox creates a temporal dilemma, a need to balance immediate expressions of a value against its long-term sustainability. This paradox also operates at the personal level, not just the societal one. In your own relationships and communities, you likely face versions of this dilemma. Should you maintain friendships with people whose values you find harmful or offensive? Should you engage with viewpoints that seem fundamentally disrespectful of others? Should you participate in communities or institutions that tolerate behavior you consider unethical? These personal manifestations of the paradox of tolerance can be particularly challenging because they lack the clear institutional boundaries and processes that societies develop. Your personal ethics must navigate this terrain without the benefit of constitutional frameworks or judicial precedents. You must determine your own boundaries of tolerance based on your values, relationships, and understanding of long-term consequences. As you reflect on these questions, notice how they create a particular quality of moral uncertainty, not because you lack strong values, but because your values themselves contain internal tensions when pushed to their logical extremes. This recognition doesn't invalidate tolerance as a principle. Rather, it invites a more nuanced, contextual understanding of how tolerance operates in complex human systems. Perhaps the most thoughtful resolution to the paradox of tolerance comes from recognizing that tolerance itself exists within a broader ecology of values. It doesn't stand alone but operates alongside commitments to human dignity, nonviolence, equality, and mutual respect. Tolerance was never meant to be the only value guiding human interaction but one element in a more complex moral framework. When we remember this, we can see that limiting tolerance toward views or behaviors that themselves undermine human dignity isn't a contradiction, but a necessary balancing of complementary values. Popper himself suggested a resolution along these lines. He argued that we should claim the right not to tolerate the intolerant, specifically when intolerant groups advocate or practice violence, and when they refuse to engage in rational argument. This approach attempts to preserve the spirit of tolerance, maintaining openness to diverse viewpoints and peaceful disagreement, while drawing a boundary at the point where tolerance would become self-defeating. As your body continues to relax and your mind drifts deeper into contemplation, consider how this paradox might inform your own approach to ethical living. Perhaps it invites a stance of reflective tolerance, a tolerance that remains open to difference and disagreement, but is mindful of its own boundaries and the values it seeks to preserve. This approach doesn't offer simple rules for determining the limits of tolerance in every situation, but it does provide a framework for thoughtful navigation of complex moral terrain. The paradox of tolerance reminds us that even our most cherished values require contextual judgment rather than absolute application. Like an immune system that must learn to distinguish harmful from beneficial elements, our moral discernment must develop the wisdom to recognize when openness serves human flourishing and when it undermines it. This isn't a failure of moral reasoning but a recognition of the inherent complexity of ethical life, the way that values, when pushed to extremes without reference to context or competing considerations, can transform into their opposites. As you contemplate the boundaries of tolerance, feel your mind gently floating toward an even more perplexing moral terrain, a landscape where our judgments of others seem to depend on factors entirely beyond their control, calling into question the very foundation of moral responsibility. As your thoughts on the boundaries of tolerance gently dissolve, allow your awareness to drift toward our third layer of moral paradox, one that penetrates even deeper into the foundations of ethical judgment. We now approach a territory where the very ground of moral responsibility begins to shift beneath us, revealing how profoundly chance and fortune shape our moral lives in ways we rarely acknowledge. Imagine two identical seeds, containing the same genetic potential, the same intrinsic qualities. One seed falls onto rich, fertile soil with abundant sunlight and water. It grows into a magnificent tree, tall, strong, and fruitful. The other seed lands on rocky, barren ground with little moisture and harsh conditions. It struggles to survive, growing stunted and twisted, bearing little fruit. The seeds themselves did nothing to determine where they would fall. Their vastly different development results not from any choice or quality of the seeds themselves, but from the arbitrary circumstances of their placement, from luck. This simple botanical analogy opens a window into our third moral paradox, the phenomenon philosophers call moral luck. This paradox challenges one of our most basic intuitions about ethics, the idea that people should only be morally judged for factors within their control. We typically believe that moral praise and blame, reward and punishment, should depend on our choices, our intentions, our actions, things we have some agency over. Yet when we look closely at how moral judgment actually operates in human life, we discover that luck, factors entirely beyond our control, profoundly shapes not just our circumstances but our moral standing itself. The term, moral luck, was coined by philosophers Thomas Nagel and Bernard Williams in influential papers published in the late 1970s, though the paradox they identified has haunted ethical thinking since ancient times. They observed that our moral assessments of people depend significantly on factors that are matters of luck rather than choice or effort. This creates a profound tension in our moral thinking. We believe people should only be judged for what they can control, yet our actual practices of moral judgment consistently violate this principle. As you continue to relax, letting your body grow heavier and your thoughts more fluid, consider how moral luck operates in several distinct domains of human life. Each reveals a different way in which fortune shapes our moral standing in ways that challenge conventional notions of desert and responsibility. First, consider what philosophers call constitutive luck, luck in the kind of person you are, including your natural inclinations, capacities, and temperament. Some people are naturally more patient, empathetic, or courageous than others. Some face powerful tendencies toward addiction or aggression. Some possess extraordinary intelligence or creativity, while others struggle with cognitive limitations. These differences profoundly affect our moral choices and character, yet they aren't themselves chosen. We don't select our genetic makeup, our early childhood experiences, or the neural architecture that shapes our personalities and capacities. Imagine two people, one born with a naturally empathetic temperament who finds it easy to care about others' suffering, another born with a neurological condition that makes recognizing and responding to others' emotions difficult. Both face a situation where someone needs help. The first person, moved by natural empathy, helps without hesitation. The second person, lacking this natural emotional response, walks past. We typically praise the first and blame the second, yet neither chose their underlying emotional capacities. Their moral standing differs due to constitutive luck, factors entirely beyond their control. Next, consider circumstantial luck. Luck in the situations you face, and the moral tests these situations present. Some people face extraordinary moral challenges. Others lead lives relatively free from difficult ethical dilemmas. Some are born into societies at war, where daily survival may require moral compromise. Others live in peaceful, affluent communities where ethical choices are less constrained by necessity. Some face powerful temptations or pressures toward wrongdoing. Others encounter circumstances that naturally encourage virtue. Think of a person living in Germany during the Nazi era, facing the choice of whether to hide Jewish neighbors at immense personal risk, versus someone living in peaceful times who never confronts such a profound moral test. Or consider a person born into extreme poverty who must steal to feed their family, versus someone born into affluence who never faces such desperate choices. We judge people differently based on their actions in these circumstances, yet none of us chooses the historical era, society, or socioeconomic position we're born into. Our moral record depends significantly on which tests fortune places in our path. Perhaps most striking is resultant luck. Luck in how our actions turn out, and the consequences that flow from our choices. Consider two equally reckless drivers. Both speed around a blind corner, taking the exact same unjustified risk. But by sheer chance, one driver encounters a pedestrian crossing the road and kills them, while the other's identical action causes no harm because the road happens to be empty. Though their actions, intentions, and moral choices were identical, we typically judge the driver who caused death much more harshly than the driver who got lucky. This pattern appears throughout our moral practices. Two equally negligent parents leave their children unsupervised. By chance, one child is injured while the other remains safe. Two equally corrupt business practices are implemented. One happens to cause widespread harm while the other goes undetected. The moral standing of these identical choices differs dramatically based solely on how things happen to turn out, on luck. Finally, there's what some philosophers call causal luck. Luck in how one is determined by antecedent circumstances, in the causal chains that produce one's character and choices. If we follow the causal history of any human action back far enough, we eventually reach factors beyond the person's control. Their genetic inheritance, early environment, the influences that shape their values and desires. This raises profound questions about free will itself. If our choices result from causal factors we didn't choose, in what sense are we truly responsible for those choices? As you contemplate these dimensions of moral luck, you might notice a profound tension emerging in your understanding. On one hand, we hold firmly to the intuition that moral responsibility requires control, that people should only be praised or blamed for factors within their power to affect. On the other hand, our actual practices of moral judgment consistently violate this principle, depending heavily on factors that are matters of luck rather than choice. This tension creates our third moral paradox, a fundamental inconsistency in how we think about moral responsibility. The recognition of moral luck has deep roots in human ethical thinking. Ancient Greek tragedians like Sophocles created stories where heroes met tragic fates not primarily through their own failures but through circumstances beyond their control. Oedipus unknowingly kills his father and marries his mother, fulfilling a prophecy he actively tried to avoid. Despite his lack of knowledge or intention, he is nevertheless considered polluted, cursed, responsible for acts he never chose to commit. These tragedies revealed the Greeks' awareness that moral standing depends significantly on fortune, that good intentions offer no guarantee against moral catastrophe. In Eastern philosophical traditions, related insights emerge in different forms. Buddhist teachings on dependent origination emphasize how all phenomena, including human character and choices, arise from complex causal networks largely beyond individual control. This recognition fosters compassion rather than harsh judgment, understanding rather than blame. Similarly, Taoist perspectives on the interconnectedness of all things challenge rigid notions of individual responsibility, recognizing how our moral possibilities are shaped by forces larger than ourselves. As your body continues to relax and your mind opens to deeper contemplation, consider how the moral luck paradox challenges fundamental concepts that structure our ethical thinking. Our notion of desert, that people deserve praise or blame, reward or punishment based on their actions, becomes problematic when we recognize how profoundly luck shapes those very actions. Our practices of moral responsibility, holding people accountable for their choices, seem potentially unfair when we acknowledge how many factors influencing those choices lie beyond their control. Even our concept of moral character, the idea that people have stable moral qualities deserving of admiration or condemnation, wavers when we see how contingent that character is on circumstances not chosen. Yet despite these deep challenges, we cannot simply abandon these practices. Human social life depends on distinguishing between good and bad actions, on holding people accountable for their choices, on recognizing and cultivating virtue. If we took the moral luck paradox to its logical conclusion, if we refrain from all moral judgment because all human qualities and actions are influenced by luck, we would undermine the very possibility of ethical life. We cannot live without making moral distinctions, yet those distinctions themselves rest on foundations made unstable by luck. Perhaps the most useful response to this paradox lies not in resolving it, which may be impossible, but in allowing it to transform how we hold our moral judgments. Recognizing the role of luck in moral life might foster greater humility in our judgments of others, greater awareness of the contingency of our own virtue, greater compassion for those whose moral failings reflect circumstances as much as choice. We might maintain the practical distinctions necessary for social functioning while holding them more lightly, with greater awareness of their inherent limitations and potential unfairness. Consider how differently you might view others' moral failings if you fully appreciated the role of luck in shaping their character and choices. The person who seems callous or unkind might have developed very differently with different genetic predispositions, different childhood experiences, different neural architecture. The person whose actions caused harm might, with slightly different circumstances, have performed identical actions that happened to cause no harm. The person facing moral challenges beyond your experience might reveal weaknesses you've been fortunate enough never to discover in yourself. This recognition doesn't eliminate moral responsibility. We still must make choices within whatever circumstances and with whatever capacities we have. But it does complicate simple notions of desert and blame. It invites a more nuanced moral stance that maintains practical distinctions between right and wrong action while acknowledging the profound role of fortune in determining which actions are available to us, which tendencies we must struggle against, which tests we face, and how our choices ultimately turn out. The moral luck paradox also invites reflection on our own moral standing. Whatever virtue we possess reflects not just our choices but our good fortune, in our natural temperament, in the circumstances we've faced, and how our actions have turned out. This recognition might foster gratitude rather than pride, awareness of contingency rather than certainty of desert. We might view our own moral achievements with humility, recognizing how differently things might have gone with just slight variations in our constitutive qualities or circumstances. As the arbitrary nature of moral fortune settles into your consciousness, allow it to create a particular quality of awareness. One that maintains moral distinction without rigid judgment, that recognizes responsibility without forgetting its limitations, that honors virtue while acknowledging its contingency. This awareness doesn't resolve the paradox intellectually, but it allows you to hold it in a way that might enrich rather than undermine your ethical life. As the arbitrary nature of moral fortune settles into your consciousness, let your mind drift toward an even more disorienting paradox. One that questions whether harming someone can be wrong if that very harm is a necessary condition of their existence. As the mysterious relationship between existence and benefit settles into your consciousness, allow your awareness to drift toward our fifth layer of moral paradox, one that emerges when we examine something so fundamental to human moral systems that we rarely question its foundations, the practice of punishment itself. Here we encounter a paradox that unfolds when we look deeply at what it means to hold one another accountable, to assign blame, to impose consequences for wrongdoing. Imagine standing before a mirror, not an ordinary mirror, but one with strange properties. At first glance, it shows your reflection clearly, affirming what you already believe about your appearance. But as you continue gazing, the mirror begins to reveal not just your reflection but the limitations of sight itself. The longer you look, the more you see distortions, contradictions, blind spots in your own perception. What began as a tool for clear self-observation becomes a revelation of the boundaries of vision itself. This peculiar mirror offers an apt analogy for what happens when we deeply examine our practices of punishment and moral accountability. What initially seems straightforward, that wrongdoers deserve consequences for their actions, begins to reveal profound contradictions when examined closely. The very concept of punishment, when gazed at long enough, seems to turn against itself, revealing tensions and inconsistencies at the heart of our moral practices. The paradox of punishment emerges from a fundamental tension in how we think about wrongdoers. On one hand, we punish people because we view them as responsible moral agents, beings capable of understanding right from wrong, of making choices, of being accountable for their actions. Punishment affirms the wrongdoer's status as a moral person rather than a mere object to be manipulated. Indeed, as philosophers like Immanuel Kant argued, to punish someone is to respect their dignity as a rational being who has made choices for which they can rightfully be held accountable. Yet paradoxically, the methods we use to punish often undermine or diminish this very moral agency we claim to be respecting. Incarceration restricts freedom of movement and association. Legal penalties often include the restriction of rights to vote, to work in certain professions, to participate fully in society. Some punishments historically have gone further, inflicting physical pain or even death. These practices don't enhance the wrongdoer's capacity for moral choice and responsible action. They frequently diminish it, treating the person more as an object to be contained or controlled than as a moral agent to be engaged. As you continue to relax, allowing your mind to explore this paradoxical terrain without tension, consider how this contradiction manifests in the various justifications we offer for punishment. Throughout history and across cultures, punishment has been justified in at least three distinct ways, each reflecting different values and assumptions about human nature, and each creating different paradoxical tensions. The retributive justification, with ancient roots in religious and philosophical traditions, holds that punishment is inherently appropriate as a response to wrongdoing, that justice requires wrongdoers to suffer consequences proportional to their offenses. As Kant famously argued, punishment is a categorical imperative, not merely a means to some further end like crime reduction. This view treats the wrongdoer with a certain respect, as someone who has made a choice deserving of a proportionate response. Yet retributive practices often inflict suffering that seems to treat the wrongdoer as less than fully human, creating a tension between respecting moral agency in theory and diminishing human dignity in practice. The deterrence justification, developed most systematically by utilitarian philosophers like Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century, holds that punishment is justified by its consequences, specifically, its ability to prevent future wrongdoing by creating fear of consequences. This approach uses the punishment of wrongdoers as a means to influence the behavior of others, treating the punished person instrumentally rather than as an end in themselves. This creates a different paradox. While claiming to protect society as a whole, deterrence-based punishment uses some individuals as tools to influence others, potentially undermining the very principle of human dignity it claims to protect. The rehabilitative justification, which gained prominence in the 19th and 20th centuries, holds that punishment should aim to reform the wrongdoer, addressing the causes of their harmful behavior and helping them develop into someone who will make better choices. This approach seems to enhance rather than diminish moral agency, yet it too contains paradoxical elements. Rehabilitative interventions often involve psychological techniques or biochemical treatments that may themselves undermine the very autonomy and self-determination they aim to develop. If rehabilitation manipulates a person into goodness, rather than allowing them to discover and choose it freely, has it truly respected their moral agency? As your body continues to relax and your mind explores these contradictions without strain, consider how these tensions have played out across the history of punishment. Ancient societies often practiced punishments that were explicitly degrading: public humiliation, physical mutilation, execution as spectacle. These practices made visible the diminishment of status that came with wrongdoing, treating the criminal as someone who had forfeited claims to full human dignity. The Enlightenment brought a shift toward more humane forms of punishment, with reformers like Cesare Beccaria arguing against torture and disproportionate penalties. Yet, as philosopher Michel Foucault famously observed in his 1975 work, Discipline and Punish, this historical shift from public torture to imprisonment didn't necessarily represent simple humanitarian progress. Rather, punishment became more hidden, more systematic, more focused on controlling not just the body but the mind and soul of the offender. Modern prisons, Foucault argued, don't simply restrict freedom. They aim to reshape the prisoner's entire being through surveillance, regulation, and psychological techniques. This historical perspective reveals how punishment has always involved contradictions, claiming to respect human dignity while often violating it, asserting the importance of moral agency while frequently undermining it, declaring the value of the individual while sometimes treating them as means rather than ends. These contradictions aren't merely incidental to punishment. They emerge from tension within the very concept itself. The paradox deepens when we consider what we now understand about the factors that shape human behavior. Contemporary neuroscience reveals how profoundly brain development, neurochemistry, and neuroarchitecture influence our capacity for impulse control, empathy, and moral reasoning. Psychological research demonstrates the powerful effects of childhood experiences, trauma, and social learning on behavioral patterns. Sociological studies show how structural factors, poverty, inequality, discrimination, create conditions that make harmful behavior more likely for some populations than others. These insights don't eliminate moral responsibility, but they do complicate simple notions of free choice and deserved consequences. If a person's harmful actions were substantially shaped by factors beyond their control, brain injuries, childhood abuse, systematic deprivation, how do we calibrate what they deserve for choices that were never made on a level playing field? Yet if we abandon the practice of holding people accountable based on these complexities, do we not in some sense diminish their status as moral agents? This creates yet another paradoxical tension. Recognizing the complexity of human choice seems to both demand and undermine our practices of moral accountability. As you continue to sink deeper into relaxation, consider how this paradox extends beyond formal legal systems into our everyday moral relationships. When we blame friends or family members for their hurtful actions, we likewise face this tension between affirming moral agency and recognizing the complexity of human behavior. If we hold loved ones accountable for every perceived wrong, we may affirm their status as responsible agents, but damage the relationships that give meaning to accountability. If we excuse all hurtful behavior based on understanding its causes, we may preserve harmony but potentially enable harmful patterns to continue. Various approaches to justice have attempted to navigate these paradoxical tensions. Restorative justice practices, with roots in indigenous traditions but gaining broader attention in recent decades, seek to address harm without the contradictions of conventional punishment. Rather than imposing suffering on wrongdoers, restorative approaches bring together those who have caused harm with those affected by it, aiming for understanding, healing, and genuine accountability. These practices attempt to hold people responsible for their actions while still honoring their humanity and supporting their capacity to make better choices in the future. Similarly, therapeutic jurisprudence approaches recognize that legal processes themselves can be either healing or harmful, can either enhance or diminish human dignity and agency. Drug courts, mental health courts, and other problem-solving courts attempt to address underlying causes of harmful behavior while still maintaining accountability, seeking to resolve rather than simply manage the tensions inherent in punishment. As you reflect on these attempts to navigate the paradoxes of punishment, you might notice a particular quality of moral complexity emerging, a recognition that justice itself contains inherent tensions that cannot be fully resolved but must be carefully balanced. Perhaps what this paradox ultimately reveals is not that punishment is fundamentally flawed, but that it requires a more nuanced, context-sensitive approach than our conventional moral frameworks often provide. This recognition invites a certain humility in how we think about justice, blame, and accountability. Rather than assuming we know precisely what wrongdoers deserve, we might approach questions of responsibility with greater awareness of the complex factors shaping human behavior, the limitations of our moral knowledge, and the inherent tensions in any system of accountability. This humility doesn't mean abandoning the practice of holding one another responsible. Such abandonment would itself deny an important dimension of human dignity. Rather, it means holding our practices of blame and punishment more tentatively, with greater openness to their limitations and contradictions, with deeper commitment to balancing the competing values at stake. In your personal relationships, this perspective might manifest as a more nuanced approach to blame and forgiveness. It might mean holding others accountable for harmful actions while still honoring the complexity of their lives and choices. It might mean creating consequences that aim to heal and restore rather than merely to inflict suffering. It might mean recognizing that justice at its best doesn't simply punish wrongdoing but creates conditions where better choices become more possible. The paradox of punishment reminds us that morality itself is not a simple system of rules and consequences but a complex, sometimes contradictory domain where competing values must be balanced rather than resolved. When we recognize the inherent tensions in our practices of holding one another accountable, we don't necessarily abandon those practices, but we might engage in them with greater wisdom, compassion, and awareness of their limitations. As the questions of justice and responsibility quietly settle in your mind, let us drift toward an even more disturbing moral terrain, a paradox that questions whether individuals truly matter, or whether they are merely interchangeable vessels of value and experience. As the questions of justice and responsibility quietly settle in your mind, allow your awareness to drift toward our sixth layer of moral paradox, one that probes perhaps the most intimate dimension of ethical life, the value of your very existence as an individual. This paradox questions something we rarely doubt, that each person has unique, irreplaceable worth, and in doing so, creates a particularly unsettling form of moral vertigo. Imagine, if you will, looking up at the night sky. Each star shines with its own particular light, some brighter, some dimmer, some with a bluish tinge, others with a reddish glow. Each seems precious and unique, a singular point of brilliance in the vast darkness. You might feel a special connection to certain stars, learning their names, tracing the constellations they form, perhaps even making wishes upon them. From this perspective, each star seems irreplaceable, with its own distinctive character and significance. Yet from a cosmic perspective, stars follow predictable life cycles. When one dims and dies, new stars form elsewhere. The particular location and brightness of each star matters less than the overall patterns they create, the total light they collectively generate, the way they enable life on distant planets. From this expanded view, individual stars begin to seem, in some sense, functionally replaceable, valuable not for their unique identities but for what they contribute to the greater whole. This stellar analogy opens a window into our sixth moral paradox, the replaceability problem. This paradox emerges from certain moral frameworks, particularly utilitarian and some consequentialist theories, that focus on maximizing good outcomes like happiness, well-being, or preference satisfaction. When followed to their logical conclusions, these theories can lead to the disturbing implication that individuals might not matter except as containers of positive experiences or value, that we are, in some sense, replaceable, provided that whatever makes our lives valuable can be reproduced in someone else's life. As you continue to relax, allowing your body to grow heavier and your mind more receptive, consider how this paradox unfolds. Utilitarian theories, in their simplest form, suggest that the right action is the one that produces the greatest amount of happiness or well-being. This seems intuitively appealing. Surely making the world a better place involves increasing the total amount of happiness and reducing suffering. Yet this apparently humane principle, when followed consistently, leads to conclusions that challenge our deepest intuitions about the value of individual lives. If what matters morally is maximizing happiness or well-being, then it seems to follow that if one happy person ceases to exist but is replaced by another equally or more happy person, this might not be bad, or could even be good, from the perspective of maximizing overall value. The particular identity of who experiences the happiness becomes irrelevant. What matters is just that the happiness occurs in someone. This suggests a view of persons as essentially vessels or containers of value, rather than as beings whose particular identities have intrinsic significance. This problem has been articulated in various forms by philosophers exploring the implications of utilitarian and consequentialist ethics. Derek Parfit, whose work we encountered earlier with the non-identity problem, explored these issues deeply in his discussion of what he called the impersonal total view, the idea that what matters morally is the total amount of well-being, regardless of who experiences it. If we accept this view, it seems we must also accept that a world where you are replaced by someone with an equally good or better life would be no worse, and could be better, than a world where you continue to exist. Similarly, philosopher John Broome has explored what he calls the individuation problem, the question of whether the identity of who receives benefits and harms matters morally, or whether only the pattern of benefits and harms itself is significant. If we focus solely on maximizing good outcomes, the particular individuals who experience those outcomes seem to become morally irrelevant. What matters is not who lives a good life, but simply that good lives are lived. Peter Singer's work on animal ethics raises related questions about replaceability. If what makes killing wrong is primarily that it deprives the victim of future positive experiences, then it might seem that raising animals for food could be justified if those animals have pleasant lives and are painlessly killed, provided they are replaced by new animals who will also have pleasant lives. The individual identity of the animal appears irrelevant. What matters is maintaining a certain level of positive experience in the world. As your body continues to relax and your mind explores these challenging ideas without resistance, notice how deeply this paradox conflicts with our intuitive sense of the value of individuals. Most of us feel that people, ourselves, our loved ones, even strangers, matter not merely as vessels of positive experiences but as unique, irreplaceable beings whose particular identities have intrinsic significance. The idea that you could be replaced by someone else with similar or greater happiness, and that this replacement would be morally neutral, or even positive, strikes at something fundamental in how we understand human value. Consider how this paradox extends into various domains of ethical life. In population ethics, the study of moral questions concerning possible future people, the replaceability problem emerges in what Parfit called the mere addition paradox. This paradox suggests that if we focus solely on maximizing total happiness, we might conclude that a much larger population with lives barely worth living could be better than a smaller population with excellent lives, provided the total happiness in the larger group exceeds that in the smaller one. The unique value of individual lives seems lost in this purely aggregative approach. In the context of animal welfare, the replaceability problem raises troubling questions about how we should value animal lives. If animals are merely containers of positive or negative experiences, without the self-awareness that creates a sense of continued identity over time, then it might seem that humanely raising and killing animals for food is morally acceptable, provided they are replaced by new animals who will also have pleasant lives. This replaceability thesis has been both defended and critiqued by philosophers working on animal ethics, revealing tensions between consequentialist reasoning and our intuitions about the value of individual animal lives. Even in bioethics and end-of-life decisions, versions of this paradox emerge. If what matters about human life is primarily the positive experiences it contains, then it might seem that allowing one person to die to save multiple others through organ donation would be justified by the greater total of positive experiences that would result. Yet many of us feel that each human life has a kind of sanctity, or inviolability that cannot be reduced to a mere calculation of experiences. As you contemplate these implications, you might notice a particular quality of moral uncertainty emerging, a sense that something important is missing from moral frameworks that reduce individuals to mere vessels of value. This uncertainty doesn't necessarily invalidate utilitarian or consequentialist approaches entirely, but it suggests that they capture only part of what we value in human life. Philosophers have proposed various ways to address this paradox. Some suggest person-affecting principles, which hold that an outcome can only be better or worse if it is better or worse for some specific person. On this view, replacing one happy person with another equally happy person would not be morally neutral, because the loss to the first person is not offset by the gain to the second. These are distinct individuals whose well-being cannot simply be aggregated. This approach attempts to maintain consequentialist reasoning while incorporating the moral significance of individual identity. Others suggest that the unique value of individuals lies partly in the relationships they form and the particular roles they play in others' lives. Your child, your partner, your friend, their value to you cannot be reduced to the happiness they bring. It lies in their particular identities and the shared history you've created together. This relational perspective suggests that people are not merely containers of value but participants in a web of connections that have their own irreducible worth. Some approaches look to virtue ethics or Kantian perspectives that emphasize respecting persons as ends in themselves rather than merely as means to producing good outcomes. From these perspectives, treating individuals as replaceable might violate the fundamental respect we owe to persons as autonomous beings with their own projects, values, and life stories. As your consciousness holds this paradox gently, without straining for resolution, you might recognize that the replaceability problem reveals limitations in purely consequentialist moral thinking, ways in which focusing solely on producing good outcomes might miss something essential about the value of individual lives. This doesn't mean we should abandon concern for consequences entirely, but it suggests that a fuller moral understanding might need to incorporate multiple dimensions of value, not just good outcomes but also respect for individual dignity, recognition of relational significance, and acknowledgement of the unique worth each life represents. The paradox also invites reflection on the nature of personal identity itself. What makes you you, rather than someone else? Is it your particular consciousness, your memories and experiences, your relationships and commitments? Or is it something more ineffable, a unique subjective perspective that could never be precisely duplicated? Our intuitive sense that we are irreplaceable may reflect a recognition that each consciousness represents a singular vantage point on reality that could not be reproduced, even if all the external qualities and experiences of our lives were somehow replicated in another. This recognition of the uniqueness of each perspective connects to traditions of thought that emphasize the inherent dignity of persons, the idea that each human being has a worth that transcends calculation, a significance that cannot be reduced to their utility or the positive experiences they contain. As Immanuel Kant argued, persons have dignity, rather than merely price. They have a kind of value that cannot be exchanged or replaced, that must be respected regardless of consequences. Yet even as we affirm the irreplaceable value of each person, we might recognize ways in which replaceability does enter our moral thinking. When we invest resources in future generations rather than extending the lives of those currently living, we implicitly accept that new lives can in some sense replace those that end. When we think about our own mortality, we may find comfort in the continuation of humanity beyond our individual lives, a kind of limited replaceability that doesn't deny our unique significance but places it within a larger continuity. Perhaps what this paradox ultimately reveals is not that individuals are actually replaceable, but that our moral understanding needs to incorporate both the unique value of each person and our participation in something larger than ourselves, the ongoing flow of consciousness and experience that continues beyond any individual life. We might matter both as unrepeatable individuals and as participants in a greater whole, our significance located both in our uniqueness and in our contribution to something that transcends us. As the question of your irreplaceability gently settles into a deeper layer of consciousness, allow yourself to feel both the particular value of your own unique being and your connection to the larger tapestry of life that extends beyond you. Your specific consciousness, with its particular qualities and perspective, represents something that could never be precisely duplicated, and yet you are also part of patterns and processes larger than yourself, contributing to a reality that will continue when your individual experience ends. As the question of your irreplaceability gently settles into a deeper layer of consciousness, let your mind drift toward the final and perhaps most challenging moral paradox, one that questions whether there are any limits to what morality can demand of us, and whether a truly moral life might be one that consumes itself entirely. As the question of your irreplaceability gently settles into your consciousness, allow your awareness to drift toward our seventh and deepest layer of moral paradox, one that challenges not just specific moral intuitions but the very structure of moral thinking itself. This final paradox questions whether there are any natural limits to what morality can demand of us, and whether a truly moral life might require sacrifices so extensive that other human values and purposes would be consumed entirely. Imagine standing at the edge of a well in an ancient stone courtyard. This is no ordinary well. As you peer over its edge, you cannot see the bottom, only darkness stretching downward. You drop a small stone and listen for the splash, but no sound returns. You drop a larger stone, then another, and still the well receives them in silence. This well appears to have no bottom, capable of receiving endless offerings without ever reaching satisfaction or completion. The more you give, the more it seems capable of receiving, with no natural point of fulfillment or closure. This bottomless well offers a fitting analogy for our final moral paradox, the demandingness paradox. This paradox emerges when we follow certain moral principles to their logical conclusions and discover that they generate obligations seemingly without limit, moral demands so extensive that they would consume all other values and purposes in human life if fully satisfied. The more we respond to these demands, the more they seem to multiply and expand, never reaching a natural point of completion where we could say, "I have done enough." As you continue to relax, allowing your body to grow even heavier and your mind more receptive, consider how this paradox unfolds within various ethical frameworks. Perhaps its clearest articulation comes from philosopher Peter Singer in his famous 1972 essay, Famine, Affluence, and Morality. Singer begins with a seemingly modest moral principle: if we can prevent something very bad from happening without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought, morally, to do it. This principle appears initially uncontroversial. If you could save a drowning child at the cost of renting your clothes, surely you ought to do so. The child's life clearly outweighs the value of your clothing. But Singer then extends this reasoning to our obligations toward people suffering from poverty and preventable diseases worldwide. If you could save a life by donating money to effective charities, and doing so would only require sacrificing things of lesser moral importance, like luxury purchases or comfort, then according to this principle, you ought to do so. The paradox emerges when we follow this reasoning to its conclusion. Given the scale of suffering in the world and the relative affluence of those living in developed countries, this principle seems to demand that we give away our resources until the point where giving more would cause us to sacrifice something of comparable moral importance to the lives we could save. For most people in affluent societies, this would mean dramatic reductions in their standard of living, perhaps giving away most of their income beyond what's needed for basic necessities. And the demands don't stop there. Beyond financial resources, there are questions of how we spend our time, energy, and attention. If working longer hours would allow you to donate more money and save more lives, should you do so? If changing to a more lucrative career would increase your charitable impact, do you have a moral obligation to make that change? The moral demands seem to expand to encompass not just our resources but our life choices, our relationships, our personal projects, potentially all aspects of human existence. As your mind explores this challenging terrain without resistance, notice how this paradox reveals tensions between moral ideals and the lived reality of being human. The paradoxical nature of these demands isn't that they're incoherent or self-contradictory, but that they seem to conflict with a deep intuition that morality should be livable, that moral principles should be compatible with recognizably human lives that include not just service to others but also personal relationships, individual projects, and pursuits that give meaning and fulfillment. The demandingness paradox has deep historical roots across diverse ethical traditions. In Christian ethics, we find Jesus instructing a rich young man to sell all his possessions and give to the poor, a demand so extreme that the man walks away in sorrow. Early Christian ascetics like the Desert Fathers embraced radical renunciation of worldly comforts in pursuit of spiritual perfection. Similarly, Buddhist traditions encourage limitless compassion toward all sentient beings and the cultivation of bodhisattva ideals, the commitment to work for the liberation of all beings from suffering. Secular ethical traditions encounter similar issues. Classical utilitarianism, with its imperative to maximize overall happiness or well-being, seems to demand that we always act to produce the most good possible, which would often require significant personal sacrifice when our resources could benefit others more than ourselves. Kantian ethics, with its emphasis on treating others always as ends in themselves, generates demanding obligations to assist others in need. Even virtue ethics, which might initially seem less demanding with its focus on character development rather than specific actions, can generate extensive obligations when we consider what truly virtuous persons would do in a world full of suffering. As your consciousness holds this paradox gently, without straining for resolution, consider various responses that philosophers have proposed. Some embrace the extreme demands, arguing that conventional moral intuitions about reasonable limits to obligations simply reflect self-interested bias rather than genuine moral insight. Singer himself has lived according to his principles, donating a significant percentage of his income to effective charities and advocating that others do the same. Groups like the effective altruism movement have developed around these ideas, seeking to maximize positive impact through strategic giving and career choices. Others argue that the apparent demandingness reveals flaws in the underlying moral theories. Perhaps morality is not exclusively about maximizing good outcomes or following universal principles. Perhaps it properly includes agent-relative considerations, special obligations to oneself, to loved ones, to personal projects that give life meaning. On this view, the seemingly unlimited demands of impartial moral reasoning must be balanced against the legitimate claims of partial human connections and commitments. Philosopher Bernard Williams argued influentially that certain moral theories alienate people from what he called their ground projects, the core commitments and relationships that give their lives meaning and purpose. If morality demands that we abandon these ground projects whenever doing so would produce marginally better consequences for others, it asks us to become detached from what makes our lives worth living in the first place. This suggests that extreme moral demands might be self-defeating, undermining the very conditions that make moral agency possible. Some philosophers propose moderate positions that attempt to accommodate human psychology while preserving moral concern for others. These approaches might include the idea of satisficing, rather than maximizing, doing enough good rather than the maximum possible, or recognizing moral permissions to prioritize personal projects and relationships within certain boundaries. Others suggest progressive standards where moral demands increase with our capacity to meet them, or context-sensitive approaches that consider what can reasonably be expected in particular social and historical circumstances. As you continue to relax, perhaps noticing the rhythm of your breathing becoming slower and deeper, consider how this paradox plays out in your own moral life. You likely recognize compelling reasons to help others in significant need, especially when you can do so at relatively little cost to yourself. Yet you also value your personal relationships, your individual pursuits and projects, aspects of life that give meaning beyond moral obligation. The tension between these values, between impartial moral concern and partial human connections, creates a lived experience of the demandingness paradox. This paradox invites a particular quality of moral awareness, one that recognizes both the weight of moral demands and their potentially unlimited nature, while also acknowledging the complex reality of human life with its multiple sources of value and meaning. Rather than resolving this tension through abstract principles alone, we might approach it as an ongoing negotiation, a process of discernment that considers both the legitimate claims of others and the conditions that make our own moral agency sustainable. Perhaps what this paradox ultimately reveals is that morality itself is not a self-contained system with clear boundaries, but an open-ended dimension of human experience that continuously reaches beyond whatever limits we attempt to place on it. The bottomless quality of moral demands might reflect not a flaw in moral thinking but an essential truth about its nature, that it calls us toward ideals that always exceed our grasp, inviting an ongoing process of growth and expansion rather than a fixed state of achievement. This perspective aligns with how many wisdom traditions understand moral development, not as reaching a state of final perfection but as embarking on an endless journey of becoming. The Zen Buddhist path is often described as endless training, with no final destination of complete enlightenment. Christian traditions speak of sanctification as a lifelong process rather than a completed state. These approaches recognize that moral growth involves not just specific actions but the gradual transformation of awareness itself, a transformation that, by its nature, never reaches completion. The demandingness paradox might then be reframed not as a problem to be solved but as a creative tension to be lived, a dynamic that generates ongoing moral growth precisely because it is never finally resolved. The bottomless quality of moral demands need not lead to paralysis or despair but might instead foster a kind of moral humility, a recognition that we will always fall short of moral ideals while continuing to be called by them. This reframing doesn't eliminate the practical questions of how much we should give, how we should balance various obligations, or what constitutes a good human life. But it does suggest approaching these questions with greater gentleness toward ourselves and others, recognizing that everyone navigates these tensions imperfectly, and that moral growth involves not just increasing sacrifice but developing wisdom about how to integrate moral concern with other human values in sustainable ways. The demandingness paradox also reveals something profound about the relationship between moral reasoning and human emotion. Purely abstract, impartial moral reasoning tends to generate unlimited demands because it lacks natural stopping points. There is always more good that could theoretically be done. Human emotions and attachments, by contrast, have natural boundaries and focal points. We care deeply about specific people, projects, and purposes rather than abstract maximization. Perhaps a fully human moral life requires integration of both these dimensions, the expansive vision of impartial reasoning and the grounded reality of embodied care. As you rest with the weight of these infinite moral demands, allow them to be present without creating tension or anxiety. Notice how this paradox, like those we've explored earlier, doesn't require immediate resolution but can be held in awareness as part of the complex moral landscape we inhabit. There's a certain peace in recognizing that moral perfection lies beyond our grasp, not because we should abandon moral aspiration, but because the very nature of moral growth involves continually discovering new dimensions of ethical possibility. The demandingness paradox completes our journey through 7 layers of moral paradox, each penetrating deeper into the foundations of ethical life. Together, they reveal how our moral intuitions, when followed to their logical conclusions, often lead to unexpected contradictions and tensions. Yet these contradictions need not undermine morality itself. They might instead invite a more nuanced, humble approach to ethical questions, one that recognizes the inherent complexity of moral reality and the limitations of any single framework for navigating it. As you rest with the weight of these infinite moral demands, allow your mind to begin integrating these 7 layers of paradox, seeing how together they create a tapestry where reality itself, our common sense understanding of right and wrong, responsibility and value, begins to shimmer and transform. As you rest with the weight of these infinite moral demands, allow your mind to begin integrating the 7 layers of paradox we've explored together. Like a wanderer who has traversed 7 distinct territories, you now stand at a vantage point where the entire landscape becomes visible, not as separate regions but as an interconnected whole. From this perspective, a larger pattern emerges. These paradoxes, when considered together, create a comprehensive challenge to our conventional moral understanding, revealing inconsistencies and contradictions at the very foundation of our ethical thinking. Imagine a vast tapestry hanging before you, an intricate weaving that, viewed from a distance, appears to depict a coherent moral reality with clear patterns of right and wrong, good and bad, just and unjust. This tapestry represents our conventional moral understanding, the shared fabric of ethical intuitions that guides our judgments and shapes our sense of reality itself. Now imagine approaching this tapestry and gently taking hold of a single thread, following it with your fingers as it weaves through the larger pattern. To your surprise, this thread, when followed to its conclusion, creates a design entirely different from what you saw at a distance. You take another thread, follow it to its end, and find yet another contradictory pattern. Each thread, representing one of our basic moral intuitions, when traced to its logical conclusion, leads to a different image of moral reality, as if the tapestry itself were composed of elements that cannot be reconciled into a single coherent picture. This is the unsettling discovery our journey through moral paradoxes reveals, that our most fundamental moral intuitions, when followed to their logical conclusions, may be fundamentally inconsistent with each other. Not merely in trivial ways that could be easily resolved through minor adjustments, but in deep structural ways that challenge the very possibility of a perfectly coherent moral framework. As you continue to relax, allowing your body to sink deeper into comfort while your mind remains gently alert, consider how each of the paradoxes we've explored undermines a different aspect of what we typically consider moral reality. Together, they create a comprehensive challenge to conventional ethical understanding, not destroying morality, but transforming how we relate to it. The trolley problem, our first paradox, challenges our understanding of right action by revealing contradictions in how we judge the morality of causing harm. When we follow the utilitarian intuition that we should minimize harm, saving 5 lives at the cost of 1, we reach conclusions in some contexts, pulling the lever, that contradict our conclusions in others, pushing the person off the bridge, despite identical numerical outcomes. This suggests that our moral intuitions about right action aren't governed by a single, consistent principle but by multiple considerations that sometimes conflict. The distinction between doing and allowing harm, the use of someone as a means rather than an end, the physical directness of our involvement. No single ethical theory seems able to capture all these intuitions without contradiction. The paradox of tolerance reveals inconsistencies in our values themselves. If we value tolerance as a principle, we seem logically required to tolerate even those who would destroy tolerance itself, yet doing so potentially undermines the very value we're trying to uphold. This suggests that even our most cherished values, when pushed to their logical extremes, may turn against themselves. Our moral values don't form a perfectly harmonious system but contain internal tensions that require ongoing negotiation rather than final resolution. Moral luck challenges the fairness of our judgments by showing how factors entirely beyond people's control profoundly influence their moral standing. We judge the drunk driver who kills a pedestrian more harshly than one who makes it home safely, though their choices and actions were identical. We praise the person who happens to be born with a naturally compassionate temperament more than one who struggles against natural tendencies towards selfishness. This paradox suggests that our practices of moral judgment, while seeming to be based on desert and responsibility, actually depend significantly on arbitrary factors, making our moral assessments of others potentially incoherent by their own standards. The non-identity problem disrupts our understanding of harm by questioning whether actions that seem to harm future people can be meaningful if those very actions are necessary for those specific people to exist at all. If a teenage mother's child has a difficult but worthwhile life, has the child been harmed by being brought into existence under suboptimal conditions? If our climate choices determine which specific future people will exist, can those choices harm those people if they wouldn't otherwise exist at all? This paradox suggests that our concept of harm, seemingly straightforward in contemporary contexts, becomes deeply problematic when extended across time and existence, revealing conceptual boundaries in our moral frameworks that we rarely notice. The punishment paradox challenges the coherence of our practices of accountability by revealing tensions within the very concept of punishment. We punish to affirm the wrongdoer's status as a responsible moral agent, yet our methods of punishment often diminish that very moral agency. We justify punishment through multiple frameworks, retribution, deterrence, rehabilitation, that can contradict each other in practice. This paradox suggests that our practices of holding one another accountable, while necessary for social functioning, contain internal contradictions that cannot be fully resolved through any single theory of justice. The replaceability problem undermines our intuitions about the unique value of individuals by suggesting that, from certain moral perspectives, people might matter only as vessels of positive experiences or value. If what matters morally is maximizing good outcomes like happiness or well-being, then it seems to follow that replacing one happy person with another equally or more happy person wouldn't be bad, potentially reducing individuals to interchangeable containers of value. This paradox reveals tensions between consequentialist moral reasoning and our deep intuition about the irreplaceable worth of each person. Finally, the demandingness paradox challenges our understanding of the scope of moral obligation by showing how certain moral principles, when followed to their logical conclusions, generate demands so extensive they would consume all other values in human life. If we accept the principle that we should prevent serious harm when we can do so at minimal cost to ourselves, we seem committed to radical levels of sacrifice that few people actually make or could sustain. This paradox suggests that either our moral principles are flawed, or most of us fall radically short of meeting our true moral obligations, either option being easy to accept. As your mind holds these 7 paradoxes together in gentle awareness, notice how they collectively create a kind of dissolving effect on conventional moral understanding. It's not that any single paradox completely undermines morality, but together they suggest that our moral intuitions may not form a perfectly coherent system capable of being captured in a single theoretical framework. Like a tapestry whose threads lead to contradictory patterns, our moral reality may contain tensions and inconsistencies that cannot be eliminated without abandoning some of our deepest intuitions. This recognition has recurred throughout human moral thinking across diverse cultures and eras. Ancient Greek tragedians like Sophocles depicted moral dilemmas without clear resolutions, suggesting that ethical conflicts might be built into the structure of reality itself rather than merely reflecting human limitation. Buddhist traditions emphasize the emptiness, sunyata, of fixed moral categories, suggesting that ethical understanding requires transcending rigid conceptual frameworks. Medieval thinkers grappled with apparent contradictions between divine justice and mercy, between free will and divine foreknowledge. Modern philosophers from Kierkegaard to Sartre explored how moral paradoxes reveal the limits of abstract ethical systems and the necessity of existential choice in the face of genuine ethical ambiguity. What does it mean for our conception of reality if our most fundamental moral intuitions contain irresolvable contradictions? Various philosophical responses have emerged to this question, each offering a different way of holding the tension these paradoxes create. Moral skepticism suggests that these contradictions reveal the ultimately subjective or non-rational nature of moral judgments, that ethics lacks the kind of objective truth found in domains like mathematics or natural science. While this approach acknowledges the paradoxes, it risks undermining the phenomenological reality of moral experience, the way ethical considerations present themselves to us as genuinely binding, not merely as subjective preferences. Moral pluralism proposes that there simply isn't a single, unified moral theory that can capture all valid ethical considerations. Instead, multiple moral frameworks, consequentialist, deontological, virtue-based, care-centered, each capture important aspects of moral reality, with no framework being reducible to the others. On this view, moral paradoxes aren't problems to be solved but reflections of the irreducible plurality of ethical considerations. The challenge becomes not finding the one correct moral theory but developing wisdom about how to balance competing valid considerations in particular contexts. Moral constructivism suggests that ethical frameworks aren't discovered like mathematical truths but constructed through human reflection and agreement. On this view, moral paradoxes reflect not objective contradictions in reality but tensions within the human project of creating workable ethical systems. The appropriate response isn't to seek final resolution of these tensions but to engage in ongoing processes of reflective equilibrium, adjusting both our principles and our intuitions to achieve greater coherence while recognizing that perfect coherence may never be attained. Particularism argues that moral reality is found not in abstract principles or theories, but in the concrete particulars of specific situations. On this view, moral paradoxes emerge when we attempt to extract universal principles from particular judgments, and then apply them mechanically to new situations. The solution lies not in better theories, but in developing more refined moral perception that responds to the unique ethical features of each situation without relying exclusively on general principles. As you contemplate these philosophical responses, you might notice that the paradoxes themselves don't necessarily undermine morality entirely but rather invite a more nuanced, humble, and flexible approach to ethical questions. Perhaps moral understanding isn't about achieving perfect theoretical coherence, but about developing practical wisdom that can navigate complex, sometimes contradictory considerations without collapsing them into artificial simplicity. The dissolving quality these paradoxes create might actually deepen rather than weaken our moral understanding, not by providing clearer answers but by fostering greater awareness of the complex, multidimensional nature of ethical reality. Like the physicist who must hold both particle and wave descriptions of light simultaneously, we might develop the capacity to hold seemingly contradictory moral perspectives in creative tension, recognizing that each captures something important about ethical life that would be lost in a simpler, more unified framework. This perspective invites a particular quality of moral awareness, one that maintains ethical commitment without dogmatic certainty, that holds moral principles while recognizing their limitations, that makes judgments while remaining open to their potential incompleteness. Rather than seeing these paradoxes as problems to be solved, we might view them as openings into a more textured, multidimensional understanding of moral reality, one that better reflects the actual complexity of human ethical experience. As the conventional moral landscape dissolves before your mind's eye, allow yourself to drift toward the question of how we might navigate this uncertain terrain, how we might find orientation when the very compass of right and wrong seems to spin in contradictory directions. As the conventional moral landscape dissolves before your mind's eye, you might feel a momentary disorientation, a sense of ethical vertigo as familiar reference points blur and shift. When our most fundamental moral intuitions reveal their contradictions, when the tapestry of our ethical understanding begins to unravel, how do we find our way? Does this recognition of paradox lead inevitably to moral nihilism, the abandonment of ethical orientation altogether? Or might it open towards something richer, more nuanced, more deeply attuned to the actual complexity of human experience? Consider the ancient navigators who crossed vast oceans without modern instruments. They oriented themselves not by fixed points on a map but by the stars, celestial bodies that appeared to move across the night sky in complex but discernible patterns. Unlike modern GPS, which provides precise coordinates with mechanical certainty, celestial navigation required a different kind of knowledge, an awareness of changing relationships, a sensitivity to context, an ability to orient by patterns rather than fixed positions. Such navigation demanded more skill than simply following a predetermined route, but it allowed journeys of discovery that would have been impossible with more rigid methods. This form of navigation offers a powerful analogy for how we might orient ourselves ethically after recognizing the paradoxical nature of moral understanding. Rather than abandoning the journey because our moral compass sometimes spins in contradictory directions, we might develop more sophisticated navigational arts, approaches to ethics that embrace complexity rather than fleeing from it, that find orientation through changing relationships rather than fixed principles, that develop practical wisdom capable of discerning patterns amid moral uncertainty. As you continue to relax, allowing your body to remain deeply at ease while your mind explores these possibilities without straying, consider how various philosophical approaches throughout history have offered alternatives to rigid moral systems, approaches that don't promise perfect certainty but provide ways of navigating ethically amid complexity and contradiction. Virtue ethics, with roots in ancient Greek philosophy but experiencing a revival in recent decades, shifts attention from abstract rules or outcome calculations toward the development of character. Rather than asking primarily, "What is the right action in this situation?" virtue ethics asks, "What kind of person should I become?" and "How would a person of good character respond to this situation?" This approach recognizes that moral life involves not just discrete choices but an ongoing process of becoming, the cultivation of qualities like wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice that enable discernment in complex situations where rules alone cannot guide us. Aristotle, the most influential virtue ethicist, emphasized that ethical knowledge is not like mathematical knowledge. It doesn't yield precise, universal formulas applicable in all contexts. Instead, he argued for the development of practical wisdom, phronesis, the capacity to discern the appropriate response in particular situations, recognizing the unique features of each context rather than mechanically applying rigid principles. This practical wisdom develops through experience, through reflection on successes and failures, through the guidance of exemplars who demonstrate virtuous character in action. Contemporary virtue ethicists like Alastair MacIntyre, Martha Nussbaum, and Rosalind Hursthouse have developed these insights in modern contexts, showing how virtue ethics offers resources for navigating moral complexity without the false certainty of either rigid deontological rules or simple utilitarian calculations. The virtuous person recognizes the paradoxes we've explored, the contradictions in our moral intuitions about harm, responsibility, value, and obligation, not as problems to be solved through better theory but as dimensions of moral reality that require ongoing attentiveness, discernment, and balance. Care ethics, developed initially by feminist philosophers like Carol Gilligan and Nell Noddings, offers another approach to navigating moral complexity. Rather than beginning with abstract principles applied to idealized scenarios, care ethics starts from the reality of human relationships and interdependence. It emphasizes attentiveness to particular others and their specificity, not human beings in general, but this person, with their unique needs, vulnerabilities, and connections. Care ethics recognizes that moral perception, the ability to see what is ethically relevant in a situation, precedes moral judgment and requires emotional capacities like empathy alongside cognitive understanding. This approach acknowledges the paradoxes we've explored not as theoretical puzzles but as reflections of the inherent complexity of human relationships. The tension between impartial moral concern and particular attachments, as in the demandingness paradox, the challenges of accountability amid recognition of moral luck, the questions about harm across time and identity. These aren't failures of moral theory but features of the relational landscape we must navigate. Care ethics doesn't promise to resolve these tensions but offers resources for holding them with greater awareness of their emotional and relational dimensions. Pragmatist ethics, associated with thinkers like John Dewey and Jane Addams, approaches moral questions through careful attention to the actual consequences of beliefs and practices in particular social contexts. Rather than seeking universal ethical truths independent of human experience, pragmatism sees morality as a kind of ongoing experimental inquiry, testing approaches, observing results, adjusting methods in response to what works to enhance human flourishing in specific circumstances. Moral principles aren't eternal truths but tools for navigating complex situations, to be refined or discarded as experience reveals their limitations. This approach embraces moral uncertainty not as a failure but as the starting point for ethical inquiry. The paradoxes we've explored represent not errors in our thinking but genuine complexities in the problems we face, tensions that cannot be resolved once and for all but must be navigated differently in different contexts. Pragmatism doesn't promise a moral map with clear boundaries between right and wrong but offers methods for finding our way through unfamiliar terrain, careful observation, experimental action, reflective adjustment based on consequences. Various contemplative traditions, from Buddhist mindfulness practices to Quaker silent worship to certain forms of philosophical contemplation, offer yet another approach to ethical navigation amid uncertainty. These traditions develop capacities for moral perception, the ability to see clearly what is ethically relevant in a situation without being distorted by rigid conceptual frameworks or reactive emotional patterns. Rather than codifying moral laws, these approaches cultivate qualities of awareness that allow more direct, nuanced engagement with the ethical dimensions of experience. For instance, Buddhist traditions emphasize the development of compassion, karuna, and loving-kindness, metta, through specific contemplative practices. These qualities aren't rule-based but perceptual. They involve seeing others suffering clearly and responding appropriately rather than following predetermined ethical formulas. Similarly, contemplative inquiry in Western philosophical traditions, from Socratic dialogue to phenomenological reflection, aims to cultivate forms of attention that can perceive ethical nuance beyond the limitations of conventional categories. As your consciousness holds these alternative approaches gently, without straining to choose between them, consider how navigating moral complexity without fixed certainty might actually better reflect the nature of human experience itself. Our lives unfold not as a series of idealized ethical dilemmas with clear boundaries, but as ongoing processes of relationship, choice, and response amid uncertainty. The moral paradoxes we've explored aren't artificial philosophical puzzles but reflections of genuine complexity in human experience. The way our values sometimes conflict, our intuitions sometimes contradict, our moral perceptions sometimes lead in different directions. Perhaps what we need isn't a perfect moral theory that eliminates these tensions but capacities for navigating amid them, qualities like discernment, compassion, practical wisdom, and moral creativity that allow meaningful ethical orientation without the false security of absolute certainty. Like celestial navigators who find their way not through fixed coordinates, but through changing relationships between stars, we might develop arts of moral navigation that embrace complexity rather than simplifying it, that find orientation through patterns and relationships rather than rigid principles. This approach fosters particular qualities that enrich rather than diminish our ethical lives. It cultivates humility, a recognition that our moral understanding, however deeply considered, remains partial and subject to revision. This humility doesn't undermine moral commitment but grounds it in ongoing inquiry rather than dogmatic certainty. We can hold strong ethical convictions while remaining open to perspectives that might reveal limitations or blind spots in our understanding. It fosters openness to dialogue, a willingness to engage seriously with those who reach different moral conclusions not merely to persuade them but to understand the perceptions and considerations shaping their views. If moral reality is complex enough to generate genuine paradoxes, then different perspectives might reveal dimensions of that reality that our own position obscures. Dialogue becomes not just a means of resolving disagreement, but a way of enriching moral perception itself. This approach also develops resistance to moral dogmatism, the tendency to reduce complex ethical questions to simple formulas or to elevate one moral consideration above all others. The paradoxes we've explored reveal how different valid moral considerations, minimizing harm, respecting autonomy, acknowledging relationship, addressing systemic conditions, can come into tension with each other. Dogmatism typically resolves these tensions by dismissing some considerations as irrelevant or subordinating them entirely to others. A more paradox-aware approach maintains the validity of multiple considerations while developing wisdom about how to balance them in particular contexts. As your mind explores these possibilities without strain, consider how we might develop practical wisdom that acknowledges paradox while still enabling meaningful action. This wisdom involves not just theoretical understanding but embodied capacities, the ability to perceive the unique ethical features of particular situations, to hold multiple valid considerations in creative tension, to respond with both compassion and discernment to complex moral realities. Such wisdom develops not primarily through abstract theorizing but through attentive engagement with actual ethical challenges, through reflection on experience, through dialogue with diverse perspectives, through the guidance of those who demonstrate moral wisdom in their lives. It involves developing not just cognitive understanding but emotional capacities like empathy, moral imagination, and what philosopher Martha Nussbaum calls moral perception, the ability to see what is ethically relevant in a situation beyond the limitations of conventional categories. Confronting moral paradox might actually cultivate deeper forms of ethical perception and responsibility, not by providing clearer answers but by inviting more nuanced questions. When we recognize the paradoxical nature of moral understanding, we become more attentive to complexity, more resistant to oversimplification, more willing to engage the full texture of ethical life rather than reducing it to manageable formulas. This attentiveness itself constitutes a deeper form of moral responsibility, not the simple discharge of clear obligation but the ongoing commitment to navigate ethical complexity with both care and courage. The religious philosopher Paul Tillich distinguished between two forms of doubt: methodological doubt, which questions in order to arrive at greater certainty, and existential doubt, which questions certainty itself as potentially idolatrous. The latter doesn't undermine faith but deepens it, transforming it from rigid adherence to dogma into a courage to be amid ultimate uncertainty. Similarly, moral doubt, the recognition of paradox and contradiction in our ethical understanding, need not undermine moral commitment but might transform it from rigid certainty into something more humble, more attentive, more deeply engaged with the actual complexity of human experience. Perhaps what these paradoxes ultimately invite is not a better moral theory but a different relationship to moral understanding itself, one that embraces uncertainty not as a failure to be overcome but as an opening toward more honest, more humble, more deeply human forms of ethical engagement. Like the ancient navigators who found their way across vast oceans not by perfect maps but by attentive relationship to constantly changing patterns of stars, we might develop arts of ethical navigation that enable meaningful orientation amid the complex, sometimes contradictory patterns of moral reality. As these alternative approaches to moral navigation settle gently into your awareness, let your consciousness drift toward more personal terrain, how these swirling paradoxes might transform not just abstract philosophical understanding but your lived experience of moral reality. As these alternative approaches to moral navigation settle gently into your awareness, let your consciousness drift toward more personal terrain. How these swirling paradoxes might transform not just abstract philosophical understanding but your lived experience of moral reality. For while we've explored these paradoxes conceptually, their deepest significance lies not in theoretical resolution but in how they reshape our inner landscape, dissolving rigid boundaries between self and other, certainty and doubt, judgment and acceptance. Imagine a still pond on a clear morning. Looking into its undisturbed surface, you see a perfect reflection of yourself, sharp, distinct, definite. This mirror-like surface represents your ordinary moral consciousness, the clear boundaries between right and wrong, the confident judgments about yourself and others, the familiar terrain of ethical certainty that structures your daily life. Now imagine dropping a small stone into this pond. The surface ripples, breaking your reflection into shifting patterns of light and shadow. What was once a clear image becomes fluid, indistinct. Yet as the surface disturbance continues, you begin to notice something previously invisible. Beneath the broken reflection, you can now perceive the actual depth of the pond, the plants and fish and stones that were always there but hidden by the perfect mirror of the surface. This rippling pond offers an apt metaphor for what happens when moral paradoxes truly penetrate personal consciousness. The dissolution of ethical certainty, while initially unsettling, can break the mirror-like surface of conventional moral understanding, revealing depths of moral experience previously concealed by our need for clear, consistent judgments. What emerges isn't moral chaos but a more textured, multidimensional awareness that encompasses rather than eliminates complexity. As you continue to relax, allowing your body to remain deeply at ease while your mind explores these subtle transformations without strain, consider how confronting moral paradoxes might lead to personal transformation through several distinctive stages. Like many profound shifts in consciousness, this transformation typically isn't instantaneous but unfolds as a process, a gradual dissolution and reconstruction of moral awareness. The initial stage often involves disorientation as certainties dissolve. When we genuinely recognize contradictions within our most basic moral intuitions, that our judgments depend significantly on luck, that our practices of holding others accountable contain internal tensions, that our altruistic principles generate potentially unlimited demands, we may experience a kind of ethical vertigo. The solid ground of moral judgment seems to shift beneath us. Clear boundaries between right and wrong begin to blur. The confident voice of moral certainty grows quieter, more tentative. This stage can feel unsettling, even threatening, as familiar reference points fade and new questions emerge without immediate answers. Yet if we stay with this discomfort rather than retreating to premature certainty, a middle stage of openness and curiosity often emerges. As rigid moral categories soften, we may discover a freshness of perception, an ability to see ethical situations with fewer preconceptions, with greater attention to their unique features. Questions become as valuable as answers. Moral curiosity awakens, not the abstract curiosity of theoretical ethics, but an embodied interest in the actual complexity of human experience. How do others navigate these tensions? What moral wisdom lies outside familiar frameworks? What ethical perceptions become possible when certainty no longer dominates consciousness? For many who travel this path, a third stage eventually emerges, a reconstruction of moral understanding that incorporates rather than denies complexity. This isn't a return to the original state of certainty but the development of a more nuanced, flexible moral awareness that can hold paradox without either collapsing into relativism or forcing artificial resolution. The boundaries between ethical categories don't disappear entirely but become more permeable, more responsive to context. Moral judgment doesn't vanish but acquires greater subtlety, greater humility, greater sensitivity to the limitations of any single perspective. Various contemplative traditions across cultures and eras have recognized this transformative process, developing practices specifically designed to facilitate the dissolution of rigid conceptual frameworks and the emergence of more fluid, paradox-tolerant forms of awareness. Zen Buddhism employs koans, paradoxical questions or statements like, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" or "What was your original face before your parents were born?" to break through analytical thinking into more direct perception. These koans aren't puzzles with clever solutions but invitations to a different kind of consciousness that transcends the limitations of conventional dualistic thinking. In a different tradition, Socratic dialogue as practiced by Plato's protagonist aims not primarily at establishing definitive doctrines, but at dissolving apparent certainty, systematically questioning confident assertions until the limitations of conventional understanding become visible. The Socratic method doesn't typically end with clear conclusions but with aporia, a state of productive confusion where rigid certainty dissolves and more honest inquiry becomes possible. This, learned ignorance, represents not failure but a more authentic relationship to knowledge and its limitations. Christian mystical traditions speak of the cloud of unknowing and the dark night of the soul, stages of spiritual development where conventional certainties dissolve, creating painful disorientation that eventually opens toward deeper forms of understanding beyond conceptual knowledge. Similarly, Taoist texts like the Tao Te Ching use paradoxical language specifically to break through rigid conceptual frameworks into more fluid awareness, speaking of doing not doing, of the usefulness of what is not, of how the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. As your mind holds these various traditions gently, without straining to choose between them, consider how this process of personal moral dissolution and reconstruction might affect your everyday ethical life. Far from undermining moral commitment, this transformation often deepens and enriches ethical engagement in several distinctive ways. It typically fosters greater compassion as we recognize the complexity within others' moral situations. When we understand how profoundly luck shapes moral standing, how contradictory our own intuitions can be, how context-dependent our judgments often are, harsh judgment of others naturally softens. This doesn't mean abandoning discernment about harmful actions but developing perception that can distinguish between the action and the person, that can recognize how circumstances shape choices, that can see others' moral struggles with greater empathy precisely because we've confronted the paradoxes in our own understanding. Consider how differently you might respond to others' ethical failings if you carried a vivid awareness of moral luck, of how your own virtue depends significantly on fortunate circumstances beyond your control, or how your reaction to others' moral inconsistency might change if you recognize the contradictions within your own intuitions. The dissolution of rigid judgment rarely leads to moral indifference. More often it creates space for a more nuanced, contextual, compassionate response to the complex reality of human moral experience. This transformation also tends to develop more authentic integrity, as we integrate rather than deny contradictory aspects of moral experience. Conventional integrity often involves conforming to consistent principles despite internal or external pressures to deviate. But a more paradox-aware integrity involves honest engagement with the genuine complexity of moral reality, acknowledging tensions between valid principles, recognizing limitations in any single framework, maintaining commitment without distorting experience to fit preconceived categories. Imagine how your relationship to your own moral failings might change through this transformation. Rather than either harsh self-judgment or defensive self-justification, you might develop capacity to hold your imperfections in a more spacious awareness, acknowledging harm without shame that distorts perception, recognizing how circumstances influence your choices without abandoning responsibility, committing to growth without the burden of perfectionism. This integration of apparent opposites, responsibility without shame, commitment without rigidity, discernment without judgment, represents a deeper form of integrity that incorporates rather than denies the paradoxical nature of moral experience. Perhaps most significantly, this transformation can develop capacity for more skillful action as we learn to navigate moral ambiguity without being paralyzed by it. When rigid certainty dissolves, we don't lose ability to act but develop a different quality of action, more responsive to the unique features of particular situations, more honest about the limitations of any approach, more capable of holding multiple valid considerations in creative tension. Like a martial artist whose effectiveness comes not from rigid strength but from balanced awareness and responsive movement, moral wisdom involves capacity to navigate complex, shifting ethical terrain with both confidence and flexibility. Consider how your approach to ethical challenges might transform through this process. rather than applying predetermined rules or calculating consequences according to fixed formulas. You might develop capacity to perceive the unique moral features of each situation, to hold seemingly contradictory considerations in creative balance, to respond from an integrated awareness that encompasses both principle and context. This doesn't mean moral relativism, where anything goes and nothing truly matters, but a more nuanced discernment that recognizes both the validity of moral distinction and the limitations of rigid categories. As you continue to relax, perhaps noticing how your breathing has become deeper and more rhythmic, consider how moral paradoxes might ultimately deepen rather than undermine your sense of ethical responsibility. When we recognize the limitations of our moral understanding, the contradictions in our intuitions, the role of luck in our judgments, the complexities that no single theory fully captures, we don't abandon responsibility but transform our relationship to it. We develop capacity to hold ethical commitment without the false security of absolute certainty, to act with conviction while maintaining awareness of partiality and limitation, to engage moral complexity with both humility and courage. This transformed relationship to ethical responsibility has been described in various ways across contemplative traditions. Buddhist teachings speak of action without attachment to results, commitment that remains passionate while releasing rigid expectations about outcomes. Christian tradition distinguishes between fear and trembling, which acknowledges the gravity of moral choice without certainty, and both reckless confidence and paralyzed indecision. Taoist texts describe non-action, wu-wei, not passivity but action that flows from aligned awareness rather than forced will. Each tradition, in its own language, points toward a quality of ethical engagement that incorporates rather than denies the paradoxical nature of moral reality. The dissolution of rigid moral categories, rather than undermining ethics, might create space for what philosopher Emmanuel Levinas called the wisdom of love, a form of ethical awareness that precedes conceptual understanding, that responds to the face of the other not through application of principles but through direct recognition of infinite responsibility within finite capacity. This paradoxical wisdom doesn't resolve the tensions we've explored but incorporates them into a more honest, more humble, more deeply responsive form of ethical engagement. As these personal transformations gently unfold within your awareness, notice how they create a particular quality of consciousness, one where paradox need not generate anxiety but can be held in spacious attention, where ethical questions remain vivid without demanding immediate resolution, where moral commitment coexists with genuine humility about the limitations of any single perspective. This quality of awareness itself, receptive yet discerning, committed yet flexible, clear yet humble, might represent the deepest gift that moral paradoxes offer to personal consciousness. As you feel these personal transformations gently unfolding within your awareness, let your consciousness begin to settle into a final state of restful contemplation, where paradox need not be resolved but can be held in the spacious awareness of a mind preparing for sleep. As you feel these personal transformations gently unfolding within your awareness, let your consciousness begin to settle into a final state of restful contemplation, where paradox need not be resolved but can be held in the spacious awareness of a mind preparing for sleep. For in this journey through moral complexity, we arrive not at a destination of certainty but at a place of rest, a resting not from moral engagement but with moral paradox itself. Consider how sleep offers a profound model for how we might relate to the ethical puzzles we've explored. Each night, we surrender our waking consciousness, with its problems unsolved, its questions unanswered, its projects incomplete, to a different kind of intelligence. We don't sleep by actively trying to sleep, by applying techniques of unconsciousness, or by solving the problem of wakefulness. We sleep by letting go, by allowing a natural process to unfold without direction from our analytical mind. And during this surrender, something remarkable happens. Our brain continues to process information, consolidate learning, integrate experiences, and occasionally generate insights that eluded our waking efforts. Imagine a river flowing toward the sea, encountering boulders, fallen trees, and narrow passages. The river doesn't solve these obstacles through analysis or force. It doesn't stop flowing to develop a comprehensive theory of obstacle navigation. It simply flows, around, over, under, through, finding not resolution but harmonious movement. The river's wisdom lies not in eliminating obstacles but in incorporating them into its natural flow, allowing them to shape its course without preventing its essential movement toward the ocean. This flowing river offers an apt metaphor for how we might relate to moral paradox, not through restless analysis aimed at final resolution, but through a kind of moral awareness that moves with rather than against complexity, that finds harmony within rather than elimination of tension, that continues its essential movement toward goodness without demanding perfect clarity at every point. As you continue to relax, feeling yourself drifting closer to the threshold of sleep, consider how both contemplative traditions and modern psychology recognize the value of resting with unresolved questions. The Zen Buddhist tradition distinguishes between the small mind of analytical thinking and the big mind of more expansive awareness. When confronting koans, those paradoxical questions like, "What is your original face before your parents were born?" Students are encouraged not to analyze intellectually but to hold the question in awareness, allowing deeper levels of mind to engage with it. The insight that eventually emerges comes not from solving the puzzle but from a transformation of consciousness that transcends the limitations of ordinary thinking. Similarly, Christian contemplative practices like centering prayer involve a gentle letting go of thoughts rather than analytical engagement with them. Practitioners learn to release even profound theological questions into a deeper silence, allowing a wisdom beyond conceptual understanding to emerge. The Desert Fathers and Mothers of early Christianity spoke of resting in God, not achieving perfect theological understanding but surrendering the questioning mind to a deeper form of knowing. Modern psychology confirms what these traditions have long recognized, that unconscious processes can work with complex problems in ways the analytical mind cannot. Research on creativity and problem-solving reveals how often breakthroughs come after periods of incubation, when we step away from active engagement with a problem and allow unconscious processing to continue. The mathematician Henri Poincaré described how mathematical solutions would sometimes appear suddenly in his awareness after he had set a problem aside, emerging, like a sudden flash, during moments of relaxation or transition. The transitional state between waking and sleeping, what psychologists call the hypnagogic state, offers particularly fertile ground for insights and integrations unavailable to full wakefulness. In this liminal consciousness, the rigid categories and linear logic of analytical thinking begin to soften. Boundaries between concepts become more permeable. Contradictions can coexist without creating tension. The mind moves more associatively, more fluidly, allowing connections and integrations that logical thinking might miss. Many scientists and artists have reported receiving creative breakthroughs during this drowsy threshold state. The chemist Auguste Kekulé described how the structure of the benzene ring came to him as he was drifting toward sleep, appearing in a dreamlike vision of a snake biting its own tail. Thomas Edison would reportedly sit in a chair holding metal balls, allowing himself to drift toward sleep knowing that as his muscles relaxed, the dropping balls would wake him, bringing back insights from this twilight consciousness. Salvador Dali called this state slumber with a key, and used it deliberately to access surrealist imagery beyond his waking imagination. What happens in this hypnagogic realm is not an abandonment of understanding but a different mode of understanding, one where the limitations of analytical thinking give way to more integrative, holistic forms of knowing. The paradoxes that create tension in our waking consciousness can be held differently in this transitional awareness, not by resolving contradictions but by experiencing them within a more spacious context that accommodates complexity. This approach to understanding connects to what the poet John Keats called negative capability. When a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Keats observed this quality in Shakespeare, whose greatest characters embody contradictions that remain unresolved yet somehow integrated within the fullness of their humanity. This capacity to remain in uncertainty without premature closure, to hold complexity without reduction, represents not an intellectual failure but a higher form of understanding that honors rather than simplifies the richness of experience. Various philosophical traditions have recognized the value of this negative capability in ethical understanding specifically. The ancient Greek tradition of aporia, the state of productive confusion that emerged from Socratic questioning, was not viewed as a dead end but as an opening toward more authentic understanding. Medieval mystical traditions spoke of the cloud of unknowing as a necessary stage in the journey toward wisdom. More recently, philosophers like Ludwig Wittgenstein have emphasized the limitations of abstract ethical theory in capturing the lived complexity of moral experience, suggesting that some forms of understanding are shown rather than said, embodied rather than articulated. As your consciousness continues its gentle transition toward sleep, consider how this restful irresolution might represent not a failure to address moral paradoxes, but a deeper wisdom that honors their complexity. The tensions we've explored, between minimizing harm and respecting individuals, between tolerating difference and preserving values, between holding people accountable and recognizing the role of fortune, between meeting obligations and sustaining human wholeness, are not puzzles to be solved once and for all but dimensions of moral reality to be navigated with ongoing attentiveness. When we rest with these tensions rather than straining to eliminate them, we create space for a more integrated moral understanding to emerge, not through analytical breakthrough but through a gradual absorption of complexity into embodied wisdom. Just as sleep consolidates the learning of the day without conscious effort, periods of restful engagement with moral paradox allow deeper integration of ethical understanding beyond what deliberate analysis can achieve. This perspective invites a different rhythm of moral development, not a linear progress toward perfect theory but cycles of engagement and rest, of analytical exploration and contemplative absorption, of active questioning and receptive listening. Like all natural processes of growth and renewal, moral understanding may develop most organically through this alternating rhythm, allowing periods of active engagement with complexity to be followed by periods of restful integration. Consider how this cyclical approach mirrors other dimensions of human flourishing. Creative work typically involves periods of focused effort alternating with periods of incubation and renewal. Relationships deepen through cycles of active engagement and restful presence. Even physical training follows rhythms of exertion and recovery. Perhaps moral development follows similar patterns, requiring both active engagement with ethical complexity and periods of rest where that complexity can be absorbed without strain. The journey through 7 paradoxes that we've undertaken together has, in a sense, prepared your mind for precisely this kind of rest. By exploring tensions within our moral intuitions, about harm and responsibility, tolerance and preservation, luck and judgment, existence and value, punishment and agency, individual worth and replacement, obligation and balance, we've gradually loosened rigid patterns of ethical thinking. Like stretching tight muscles before sleep, this exploration has created greater flexibility and moral awareness, allowing for a more comfortable rest with complexity rather than a restless striving for resolution. This loosening of rigid patterns doesn't imply moral relativism or indifference. Rather, it creates space for a different kind of moral commitment, one grounded not in abstract certainty but in embodied wisdom that has absorbed rather than eliminated complexity. Like a river that has encountered many obstacles and incorporated them into its flowing course, moral understanding that has engaged deeply with paradox develops a particular quality, either rigid nor formless, either dogmatic nor directionless, but flexibly responsive to the actual contours of ethical terrain. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke, in his Letters to a Young Poet, offered advice that applies powerfully to our relationship with moral paradox. Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books that are now written in a very foreign tongue. Do not now seek the answers, which cannot be given you because you would not be able to live them. And the point is, to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. This living with questions, this patient, attentive relationship to paradox, represents a deeper engagement with moral reality than any premature resolution could provide. It creates space for wisdom to emerge not through conquest of complexity but through ongoing conversation with it. And like all genuine conversations, this engagement transforms both participants, deepening not just our understanding of moral paradox but our capacity for nuanced ethical perception and response. As you drift now toward sleep, allow these 7 layers of moral paradox to rest gently in your awareness, not as problems to be solved but as openings into a more spacious understanding. The trolley problem with its conflicting intuitions about harm. The paradox of tolerance with its tensions between openness and preservation. Moral luck with its challenges to conventional judgment. The non-identity problem with its questions about harm across time. The punishment paradox with its contradictions about accountability. The replaceability problem with its challenge to individual value. And the demandingness paradox with its seemingly bottomless obligations. Let all these rest like seeds in fertile soil, either forced to immediate growth nor forgotten, but held in the darkness where deeper processes can unfold. Feel your breath deepening, your body growing heavier, as the analytical mind surrenders to the wisdom of rest. The paradoxes that unmake conventional reality have prepared a space for dreams, for renewal, for the emergence of fresh insight with the coming dawn. In letting go of the need for final resolution, you open to a deeper form of understanding, one that honors complexity without being paralyzed by it, that remains committed to moral truth while acknowledging its paradoxical nature, that finds orientation amid uncertainty not through rigid formulas but through embodied wisdom. Sleep now, knowing that the questions that have no final answers are often the ones most worth asking. Your journey through these paradoxes hasn't brought you to a destination of certainty, but has expanded your capacity for moral navigation amid complexity. Like a river finding its way to the sea, not by eliminating obstacles but by flowing with and around them, your moral awareness has been invited toward a more fluid, responsive relationship with ethical reality in all its paradoxical fullness. The poet Wallace Stevens wrote, "The final belief is to believe in a fiction, which you know to be a fiction, there being nothing else. The exquisite truth is to know that it is a fiction and that you believe in it willingly." Perhaps something similar might be said of our relationship to moral understanding, that the deepest wisdom comes not from achieving perfect ethical theory but from engaging fully with moral reality while honoring its inherent complexity, its resistance to final resolution, its openness to ongoing discovery. Rest now in this restful irresolution, this peaceful engagement with paradox. The questions will remain in the morning, but something will have shifted in how you hold them, not through analytical breakthrough but through the quiet work of consciousness as it integrates complexity beyond the reach of deliberate thought. Sleep well, dreamer of ethical dreams, navigator of moral paradox, for wisdom continues its quiet work even as you rest. As we've journeyed through these 7 layers of moral paradox, from the trolley problem to the demandingness paradox, we've witnessed how our most cherished ethical intuitions, when followed to their logical conclusions, often lead to contradiction and uncertainty. Yet this dissolution of moral certainty isn't cause for nihilism or despair. Rather, it invites a more nuanced, humble approach to ethical life. Perhaps wisdom lies not in resolving these paradoxes but in learning to navigate with them, developing moral perception that can hold contradictions without collapsing into simplified formulas. Like ancient navigators who oriented by moving stars rather than fixed points, we might develop ethical capacities that embrace complexity rather than denying it. This journey reveals that morality isn't a map with clear boundaries, but a living relationship with an ever-changing landscape. It suggests that ethical growth involves not just knowing the right answers but developing qualities like discernment, compassion, and moral imagination that allow us to respond wisely to the actual complexity of human experience. By encountering these paradoxes not as problems to be solved but as invitations to deeper understanding, we open ourselves to a more authentic engagement with moral reality, one that honors both our capacity for ethical commitment and the inherent complexity of the terrain we navigate. If these moral paradoxes have shifted something in your understanding, I'd love to know which one resonated most deeply with you. Was it the trolley problem that challenged your intuitions about harm? The moral luck paradox that questioned the fairness of your judgments? Or perhaps the replaceability problem that made you reconsider the unique value of individuals? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective might illuminate aspects of these paradoxes that others haven't considered. Philosophy thrives through dialogue, and your contribution enriches our collective understanding. If you found this journey valuable, please consider supporting this channel by subscribing and hitting the notification bell. Each week, we explore another dimension of philosophical thought that challenges conventional understanding and expands moral imagination. For those who want to dive deeper, I've created a special meditation audio that guides you through these paradoxes in a contemplative context, available through the link in the description. And if you know someone struggling with moral certainty who might benefit from this perspective, please share this video with them. Sometimes, the greatest gift we can offer is a new way of seeing familiar questions. Until next time, sleep well with your paradoxes.